All right, so this slide I'm calling the evolution of enlightenment. And everything is growing and evolving and emerging physically and psychologically. And our collective conscious and unconscious is growing. And so, where does it start? Well, if we go back to the area that we now call India, a couple of things are going on. First, there's records going back about 5,000 years of tantrikas. And these were people that were having very rich experiences. And what I've read is that there were very, very rich ashrams that um, lived in sort of autonomous zones between kingdoms. And kings and emperors would go and meet and counsel with these wise sages. And they would do that because the tantrikas were, well, they were rich and powerful. And they were present, they were awake, and they were using everything: alcohol, psychoactive mushrooms, all sorts of things. And these eventually have been persecuted and wiped out. So apart from people that sort of revisit and discover tantra, like myself and Jantra, we there isn't like really much of a continuous line. It's sort of a dotted line from the past to the present. In part, the people that were responsible for this were the Jain and the Hindu religions that developed, because the tantrika is an individual, and uh, a religion like Hinduism or um, is a collective of people, right? So there's a history of 24 Jain Tirthankaras, and these have a history that go back anywhere from 3 to 6,000, and some claim as far as 80 to 100,000 years ago. And who knows? It may be possible. The last Jain Tirthankara is known as Mahavir, and he was an emperor. Mahavir uh, awakened, and what he basically did is that he regressed out of society. He left his palace, he left his kingdom, he left his queens and concubines and all of that. This is about 600 BC. And he ran around naked, and he was a raw vegan, and he was sort of mute. He was a raw vegan body. He wasn't a mute. He could speak, but he didn't want to use language. He was just probably a beautiful, gentle being that walked around and wouldn't even step on an ant if he could avoid it. And back then, they didn't think of plants as being alive. So the whole philosophy of the Jainas today, and there aren't too many of them because they believe that they shouldn't kill anything, so they only eat vegetables, so that they don't obviously accept that they're alive, even though vegetables are part of life like anything else. And it is possible that Mahavir and Prince Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, were contemporaries. My understanding is that Mahavir was in his 80s when Gautama became enlightened. And Gautama, the Buddha, not the first Buddha, right? All of these guys were Buddhas before. They were all enlightened. And there have been millions of Buddhas after, and there were probably many Buddhas before. But what's interesting about him is that he was the first that was able to communicate. He was the first Buddha with the communication app, right? The aptitude to communicate. And he wore clothes, even though it was just robes, and he ate everything that was put into his begging bowl. My understanding is he died of eating bad pork. And he is the founder, the father of Buddha consciousness. And this was about 550 BC or something like that, according to the calendars. And his path was the path of the mind, the path of awareness. He was highly educated and wealthy. By the way, so was Mahavir. A contemporary of Buddha is Lao Tzu in China. And he was the founder father of the first communicator of Tao consciousness. And this is the path of a body minus the mind. Buddha consciousness is the path of the mind minus the body. The body, you renounce the body, you leave the body, and you just function as a state of being present. And it's through your awareness of your mind. Tao is slightly different. It's the path of an awakened body in a state of no mind. And there's a lineage of Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, Lei Tzu, and a bunch of others. Taoism kept going and evolving, and so did Buddhism. Now, Buddha predicted that within 500 years of his enlightenment that it wasn't going to work anymore, that his Buddha field, that his teachings weren't going to be active anymore. Now, chronologically, one of Buddha's disciples that became awakened was sent by Buddha to carry his message. And this other Buddha went to Egypt and set up the schools of mystery. Now, curiously enough, there's a story that says that Jesus left the Jerusalem area and went to Egypt and spent some time studying in the mystery schools. And this is evident in his scriptures and in his words that have a definitive taste of Buddha consciousness. But this was right around the time that this was 500 years later, where the teachings weren't going to work anymore. And it's a different operating system. The Middle Eastern mindset and operating system was different than the Indian mindset. So Jesus got lost. He, for sure, must have had an awakening experience while he was at the mystery schools in Egypt, but when he tried to translate it into his language and tried to communicate, he got lost. And something important to note is that the Jainas, Mahavir, Gautam, Lao Tzu, they all regressed they all renounced society. They stepped out of society. Mahavir did it completely naked. Buddha did it with robes and a begging bowl. Lao Tzu just went off to live in the woods, and they didn't want to be part of society. Jesus came in and he tried to change society. And of course, he pissed off a lot of people, and in part because he was poor and uneducated, and the rabbis were all rich and powerful, and the people were starting to listen to him. They could relate to what he was saying. So he got crucified, he got nailed to a tree, and the pain and the suffering of being there is what awakened him. And his path, known as Christ consciousness, is the path of the heart. And this is about acceptance. He had to accept that these people were going to crucify him for not liking what he had to say. And my understanding is that he was crucified on a Friday, and normally it takes 3 days for someone to die of crucifixion. If you're hung up, tied, nailed in that position, the intercostal muscles, the muscles between your ribs that are there to breathe, after 3 days of that, they collapse and then you suffocate. You can't breathe anymore. And this is what you die of from crucifixion. You don't bleed from the nails, and they have to tie you anyway. The nails are just there to hurt you more. And you don't die from the pain. It's the fact that your intercostal muscles will collapse and then you can't breathe anymore. So my understanding is that he was brought down on the next day, or that later that night, or the next day, because it was a Sabbath on Saturday, and people don't get crucified on Saturdays, on Sabbath days, and that he and St. Thomas and some of his women followed him to India. And in India, there was no problem, because in India, everybody's a god. So claiming that you're the son of God, well, everybody's the son of God, and if you wrap a ribbon around a rock and do a little chant on it, then right there, that's God right there. So there was the school of Gnostics and Gnosticism that grew from there. And Gnosticism is all about personal spiritual path, and it's against organized religions. In the Middle East, Gnosticism, the Gnostics were wiped out, but in Goa, there is evidence of Christianity as brought, or teachings of Christ as brought by St. Thomas. This is a bit of a dead end, though. There are some people who call themselves Gnostics, but it's not really a big school, and I'm not sure you can go and become awakened through the Gnostics. So, continuing our chronological evolution of enlightenment. Right, so Bodhidharma took the teaching, 500 AD, right, it's about 1500 years ago, takes the teachings of Buddha. He meets with the followers of the Tao. And the fusion of Buddha consciousness and Tao consciousness is what creates Zen consciousness. And Zen is the only continuous school of awakening that goes all the way through. And our approach, even though I've never gone and studied at a Zen monastery, um, uh, our natural approach follows as a parallel path to Zen. It's sort of a modern psychedelic Zen path. And Zen uses everything because in Buddha consciousness, you are just simply aware. You just watch. You don't interfere with absolutely anything um, because nothing really matters. You're just present. And the Tao is all about the flow of nature. So if you're happy, you're happy. If you're angry, you're angry. If you're sad, you're sad. And the fusion is very interesting because in Taoism, uh, if somebody slaps you and you're sad, well, you're just sad. It's not a big deal. You just allow it to happen. And if you laugh or scream or cry or sneeze or have, if you naturally can be angry as a response, there's no problem. But with Buddha awareness added to that, the Zen system came out. And in Zen, what you do is you actually use, as needed, anger. If you need anger, you can use anger. You can use violence. Zen masters are famous for carrying canes that they use to beat their disciples that are too lost in their heads. And this leads to the next point, which is by this point, mind is so much more complex. Okay, 1,000 years have gone by, and Buddhism and Taoism have gone as far as they can, but the collective unconscious is much larger. So it's also evolving. And by the time we get to here, the story goes that Bodhidharma, in order to be able to stay present, he had big bushy eyebrows. He would pluck his eyebrows, and that the eyebrows that would drop turned into green tea bushes. Now, in I think the Taiyin or Tian, or I'm not sure what the word is in Chinese for the region where Bodhidharma went, is where green tea grows naturally. And the monks there, the Zen monks discovered that if they made a tea, an infusion of the green tea, that allowed them to stay alert and to stay awakened. So green tea is and caffeine, tein is a mild psychoactive. So in a way, the Tantrikas were the first enlightened psychonauts because they were using magic mushrooms and whatever they could find. And Bodhidharma, the Zen, started using green tea. Now, uh, I'm going to go back into this more fully. I just want to put a little side note. In the 1300s, Sufism, which emerged from Islam, Rumi was a Sufi master who awakened by spinning, by whirling like a dervish. And you can do this. I've done this, and you watch kids do it. You spin, 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 and you get to a point. Well, you do it on a soft place, like on a beach somewhere, and you will get to a point where you no longer feel like you're moving. Your body is whirling around, and the images are spinning around, but you actually find your center. And what I've read is that Rumi spun for 30 plus hours or something like that. And by being just centered and present, he was able to become conscious of his consciousness. He was able to become enlightened by that. And he's an enlightened poet, a mystic. Um, the Sufi consciousness, Sufi dervish consciousness, is still alive in a sense. I mean, there's places in the Middle East and Turkey where you can go, but maybe for a mind, an Aboriginal, a tribal mind of back then, this would be the way to awaken. I'm not sure that this alone would be the way to awaken. And with the Sufis, they used humor and idiocy and foolishness to point out the nonsense of how our minds are. And this is in direct contrast to the strict nature of Islam. Right? So there have been many others, and I have a slide in a separate presentation. Heraclitus was enlightened, and he was part of the Egyptian mystery schools, and Socrates, though not Aristotle, Socrates was killed for it, poisoned for it. Gurdjieff, an enlightened master of the 1900s, Krishnamurti and Osho, Meister Tolle, and potentially Eckhart Tolle, and there's many others that I'm going to discuss. Now, the path to enlightenment, there's basically two paths. And you start off from a body that's present and alert the valley starts with the body that's present and alert. And most people are lost, so they're not present alert, and they try to become enlightened. So their body isn't present, their mind is in some um, mental projection of being, you know, woke AF, and you never get there. But you start off with a mind, with an alert, awakened body, and the path is you either follow the path of awareness, the discipline of awareness, and that takes you to become aware of the need for acceptance, and then you have a heart awakening and you can become enlightened. This was my path. This is what I did. I spent, well, most of my life, and of that 13, the last 13, from the age of 30 to 43, using medicines and psychoactives to explore my mind to be able to awaken. And it was more of the Zen path because mind is more complex. So my path was more like this. But Zen is a path of awareness. Jantra's path is different. She started first with full acceptance. She is a Christ consciousness. She accepts first, and then she has to figure out. So you do this part first, and then this part, and it's not necessarily linear in any way, right? And she's been following her Zen path. So this has changed, and that's the difference between samadhi and satori, and I'm going to discuss that in another slide.